Yeah, hello everybody. International trade explanation. Why do we trade with each other? And we are just in a, yeah, so to speak, descriptive model where we just, yeah, look at the data, look who is trading with each other, and then we try to interpret how do we trade with one country more than with another. And yeah, this model was introduced so in the 70s, 80s of the last century, and it is called the gravity model of international gravity. So international trade. Well, and the explanation for this name is just that we take an explicit function in order to get an explanation for the trade volume of two trading partners, and this function looks more or less like the famous gravity equation of Newton of the 17th century when he has explained the force between two planets. And so what we do is that we exchange the two masses of the planet, which we find with, so to speak, the economic masses of your country measured by GDP. And later on, I will explain also that we have here other exponents. Here in the gravity model of physics, we have exponents of 1 and 2. And well, the explanation is that we find, very surprisingly, that the larger the countries who are trading with each other, the larger is the trade volume. And this we can explain from both sides, demand and supply side, that we say, well, a large country has more production possibilities, and there the probability that they sell more on the world market is also higher. And from the demand side, there we have the distribution approach of GDP, and this just means that we can interpret overall GDP also as total income of a country, and the larger the total income of a country, the more they would buy. There you can interpret this, what you have learned in microeconomics, that in general we say that we have, so to speak, normal goods, and for normal goods you have explained that the dependence on everything else to be constant. If we increase the income, then our demand would rise. Well, and then I explained to you why do we take the, so to speak, more complicated functional form of multiplying these economic sizes of the two countries. And the reason for this is just when we look at the trade volume between a very large country, and a very small country, then of course, if we would take the sum, the overall sum would be more or less still the size of the very large country compared to the small country. Nothing would change. But of course, if you think of the trade volume between the United States and Luxembourg, then this highly depends on the relative size of the small country Luxembourg with the United States. Well, they are not that large that they really can buy lots of goods and services from the United States. And therefore, if you multiply a small number with a large number, then this is some kind of average. Think of this. About this, we also talked when we were averaging growth rates. This we can, so to speak, interpret as a geometric mean. And then, of course, also we could interpret the exponents here as something like the weights of the geometric mean of these two countries, because then a small number multiplied with a large number is then maybe something in the middle. So a medium sized number. And well, that's not all, because then, of course, also not very surprising if we think of the distance. So first of all, measured just in kilometers. Then we think of transportation costs if these two partners want to trade with each other, and the higher the transport costs, the lower the trade volume. This is, of course, also a good hypothesis, and therefore we divide by the distance. And the explanation why are we dividing and not subtracting is also more or less the same as the explanation when I said not the sum but the product of the two numbers, that we say, okay, well, we would have a problem with the units. Distance is, of course, measured in another unit compared to GDP in euro or US dollars. And also we have the problem that if the distance would be too large, so to speak, then this number um, could be also negative. And the last one, then this I explained then down here, is that we also can interpret very nicely these exponents as the trade elasticity of these variables when we take just the log derivative of this whole function. Then this function translates just into a sum of the log variables with the coefficients alpha, beta, and gamma in front of these log variables. And this log derivative, where did I do it? Here. This is very, very often done in economics when you want to do econometrics, when you want to do quantitative analysis, that you do not take the variable itself, but the log of the variable, because then you obtain these sum of the variables. And of course, very, very often in economic models, we have these multiplicative dependence. Just think of price times quantity is revenue, or wage times labor amount is labor costs, and so on. And of course, when you then want to do a regression is much easier done when you have the sum of variables and not some complicated square root of a divided by b and so on. Okay, so this maybe you can keep in general in mind. This is very often done in economics in order to do quantitative analysis. Okay, and then we also interpreted the distance in a quite more general way than only in kilometers with respect to transportation costs. There we said, well, there is maybe then something like an economic distance. And there we, for example, remember we saw that the trade volume between Ireland and the United States was relatively higher compared to the size of Ireland, for example, versus Germany. I think it was 15% with Ireland and 25% of the trade volume with Germany, but Germany is, I think, six or seven times larger, measured in GDP relative to Ireland. But then, well, we can say from the tradition that we have many, many Irish families now being US citizens due to their change of the economy in the 19th century when they left because of the poverty situation in Ireland, their country, moving to the United States. And of course, also they are talking more or the same language. And this is also not very surprising that then it is easier to trade with each other when the countries have a so-called cultural affinity. And then, of course, also not only kilometers in distance, this is more or less obvious. When you have mountains, when you have an ocean in between two countries, then of course this is on the one hand an obstacle for international trade, or the geographic situation on the other hand, when you have some region where, so to speak, it is very easy to build a harbor. Think of the islands in Greece. There you find always harbors where you have, so to speak, natural harbors, where you do not have to really build a harbor because due to the natural circumstances, it is easy to implement in some region a harbor. And if you have a harbor, then this, of course, also fosters trade. Or if you have countries which are connected with a large river. On the river, especially large goods, you can easier transport, and therefore this also would then foster trade. And of course, in history, we see that the economic development quite often has followed the large rivers, especially in Europe. So also interpret the dimension of geography in a very broad way. Well, and then of course, our institutional borders. When you have different countries, then you have in general different rules. Who is allowed to do to trade in a country? Um, this differs in different countries, and when you have then their different rules, then of course this is also an obstacle on the one side. Or if you then create new institutions, you still have different countries, but take the European Union, for example, in the midst of the 90s, due to the Maastricht contracts, we created, so to speak, one common economic market, um, although we have still different countries. Well, and there we have more or less now a real-time experiment where we drastically can see the effect of such a border is when UK has left the European Union. Later on, I will also show you some numbers of the development of the international trade of UK. Okay, and then of course you can interpret a language as a border in this sense of this dimension, or you can interpret, and therefore I have written down here also C number 2, the language as something like a part of the cultural dimension. Well, it depends what you like. So there is no clear definition where you put the language as an obstacle or as a possibility when you have the same language that it fosters trade. And the last dimension is, so to speak, yeah, a new dimension that we see due to the development of very large companies, firms in the world, international companies, that if in a country you find many international corporations, then of course you see that this also have a positive effect on the overall trade of a country, and the explanation is also yeah, quite easy, that you say, well, you have an international corporation which is situated in different countries, then it is not very surprisingly that within this cooperation situated in different countries that you have a trade dependence within a company. And the more or the larger you have such an international company in your country, then you find also a positive effect on international trade. So in the end, here we have then broad interpretation of a general distance with 5 dimensions. Yeah, and I have already talked about the EU. Now we want, yeah, to take another example, or here this I forgot. Well, of course, in general, always you can look or you have look at the special example, but in general, what we find, especially when we take this general distance, that overall the estimations show that if you reduce uh, the distance of roughly 1% due to its different dimensions, that you have more or less almost one-to-one implication on the trade volume. So if you are increasing the distance by 1%, then the decrease of the trade volume would be also almost 1%, and this would then mean that you would find that these coefficient gamma here, if you make an quantitative analysis, that gamma would be roughly around 1. This is what one in general finds. Okay, and now we want to have a deeper look in the effect of institutions forming a common market, and the last one will be then also that we want to have a look of the effect of borders. So trade agreements in general want to reduce formalities And of course, within the European Union, you do not find any tariffs anymore. And this, of course, if you have no direct effect of the countries on the prices via tariffs, then this should also increase the trade volume. And for this, now let's have, well, maybe the last time in this lecture, the example of NAFTA or USMCA, and this is the trade agreement between USA, Canada, and the United States. Well, and when he was the first time in Oval Office, Mr. Trump said that this has been the worst deal the United States has ever done. Well, if you look at the data of the last 40 years since they had this trade agreement, so forming, so to speak, for the whole of North America, one trade union with low formalities, with almost no tariffs, then one can say that especially the United States have benefited from this trade agreement. Well, anyway, already in his first administration, he has he wanted to change this trade agreement, but in the end, it was only slightly changed. That then afterwards called the trade agreement was then called USMCA. So here, United States, USA, Mexico, sorry, Mexico and Canada. But now we know that almost every day he says, well, 25% of tariffs for goods of Mexico or Canada, and 2 hours later he has made a call with the president of Canada, and then the tariffs are cancelled. So actually, we don't know what happens. But this we will see then in the future data, in the data which we have in the last years. We see that in general, such a trade agreement fosters international trade. And for this, we go back into our analysis. And remember, there we at first have looked at the relative trade volumes of the United States with the European Union. And now we want to add Mexico. So didn't I save this because this is the wrong file? Oh, where's my other file? This one? No, this is the overall. This one? This I should have looked up before. So I also uploaded the wrong file. Have you looked at the file I uploaded on the web page? Oh, here it is. So this we need. Okay. Okay, so there we have found that we found this positive dependence between the relative size of a country and the relative trade volume. And within this graphical representation, we now want to add Mexico and Canada. So then at first we need the GDP of Canada. There it is. And this is trade volume, and where do I have exports, imports, and GDP. Where did I have my GDP? Here, there's a GDP, and so we need Canada. Then I copy it again. And Canada. And 35 and 24. 35. There we are. GDP, no. And Canada and Mexico we need. This is 115 and also 24. 115. GDP. If we now also want to include these two countries, then of course also the overall size of our total region is increased by Spain, by Canada and Mexico. So then we need here the Eurozone. Oops. Plus Mex plus Canada. This is then Eurozone plus Canada plus Mexico. And now the relative size of all these ones. And now we have to divide by not E36, but E35. So in the end, we more or less do the same as last week. This didn't work also last week. I don't know why. Percent once. So now these would be our numbers for GDP, and now including Mexico and Canada. And what we need is now also Mexico and Canada, the trade volumes. And this we had here. So fortunately they are the almost two largest one. 24, and the first one was Canada. So then, up, hasn't taken it again. These two, copy, and paste, but the other way around. And here we have imports. Am I right? Exporters. So exporters are imports of the United States. This is okay. And then exports also Canada and the United States, Canada and Mexico. So, but also exchanging this. And now we want, this was H2 overall trade is, this was the sum of Eurozone up, no, this is not right. And now this is right. G and J, yo. And now we need the overall sum again of the trade volume. Is this possible that this is right? Spain, tenth of it. And let's see, Germany, roughly a fourth of it. Yo, this is okay. So this I always do, because if you do this manipulation, that in general just have a look that the size of your formulas, the number which are coming out, that they have a size which you are expecting. So what I have looked is, well, this number is the trade volume of Mexico, and it is 10, 15 times higher than of Spain. This is reasonable. And this trade volume is 4 times higher roughly compared to Germany. So this is also, yeah, roughly okay. Then we need these two, and now divided by 24. And that's, now we can also, now we have this and this. Let's copy this one and data. Oops. This has then to be P. Okay. And also with Canada and Mexico, so down to 23. And trade also down to 23. And now let's see that this is also okay. This is okay. This is okay. Yeah. And if we now compare these two, so let's say this is EU, USA, and this is EU plus mix plus can USA. And then, of course, you see here with an R squared in the neighborhood of 1, which is from a descriptive perspective quite quite okay. And you see, so to speak, almost all data points are roughly as a cloud around your fitted linear line. And I think if I remember it right, this was Ireland, and there we had already the explanation, while we have there a larger one, and the other one, I think this was Netherlands, if I'm right. Let's see. Oops. GDP 7.4 and GDP 7.4 and trade 4.9. Oops. Yeah, this is Netherlands, and there we had also the so this is then cultural affinity or borders, especially when you also take the language as an explanation, that it is relatively higher. And here, of course, you have the harbor. So this is the dimension. Geography. Yeah, and then you see here the relative size of trade of Mexico and Canada is compared to the um, trade volume of the European countries much larger, and the explanation is the neighborhood. So to speak dimension classical, distance and borders due to US, I say still, USMCA. And for Canada, of course, you have also the dimension cultural affinity plus language. And what you also see is, well, if you do not think of this sometimes very large effect of distance, and you do, so to speak, only your regression with a maybe still main parameter of economic size, then you see here you have a very poor outcome for the correlation coefficient, for the coefficient of determination. So poor R squared because of the outliers Mexico and oops and Canada. Because this, of course, you should also keep in mind, a linear regression you can do always, um, but you have to interpret the outcome. Okay, and then one last nice experiment. It is an older paper, but it is really nicely done when we want now to, so to speak, directly tackle the different dimensions in the distance, and especially when we want to tackle the effect of national borders between countries. And this is, of course, always not that easy. On the former slide, I also mainly argued in a qualitative way when I said, well, in Netherlands, the reason is harbor, it's a neighborhood, it is the trade union of North America and so on. But of course, we also want to go into detail. And this to do is not that easy because then you have to look, so to speak, for natural experiments in social sciences where you can then really do something like a partial analysis, where you can say, well, I have 5 dimensions of distance, Do I have a situation, or can I create data? Can I look for data where more or less 4 of these dimensions are the same and only one, this border dimension, is changed? And this was done by colleagues when they looked at the trade of the states of the United States and the provinces of Canada. How do they trade with each other? And there they looked at the trade volume of the province Columbia, number 0 here. And then they had a look, what is their trade volume with the Canadian provinces moving to the right. So here, the, so to speak, physical distance from Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Ontario, Quebec, and New Brunswick, you are just increasing. Well, and now they looked at states of the United States which have more or less the same number of inhabitants, and where you also somehow can say, well, the physical distance, I'm also more or less I'm increasing the physical distance in more or less the same way. So here, the direct neighborhood, state of Washington. The second one, Montana. So the distance of British Columbia to Washington is, as a neighboring state, the same as more or less the distance between British Columbia and Alberta. And here also the distance between British Columbia and Saskatchewan, more or less the same with Montana, with British Columbia and Montana. And though they identified here, so to speak, also 6 other states of the United States where you can say that in general the relation between British Columbia and Canadian provinces 1 to 6 and US states 1 to 6 is almost the same, and only, or the only difference in the relation is the national border between USA and Canada. Well, and then what we expect is that in general, although the relation is almost the same, but still we have a national border, that the relative trade volumes between the inner Canadian trade of British Columbia should be significantly higher compared to the trade volume of British Columbia and the US states. And the next slide is then here the, of course, also not very surprising outcome, but of course, we have to test our hypotheses. Is there really a quantitative effect which we can see? And there you see, these are the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That we really can see the relative trade volume of the inner Canadian trade is roughly, here it's 3, 2, 6, 10, larger than 10, also 10, let's say roughly 3 to 10 times larger than the relative, let's call this international trade volume between Canada and the United States. So, and this, I think, is a really, nice analysis when we want then really to try to identify the effect of these 5 dimensions of the general distance in the gravity model of international trade. Because of course, always there can be good arguments why it should be like this. But then, of course, we have to go into the data and see, well, do the data really follow our arguments? Do I really see a relevant quantitative effect? Okay, so then this took a little bit later, but let's anyway start with the next topic when we are developing further our theoretical trade models. And then this is this I need. Yeah, and to summarize this, we went through the different aspects of this gravity model, and I will see, I think in the end we are around 10, 15 guys writing in the end your term paper, and at one part I think I will give you a task doing some analysis which we have done here, especially of the looking at the United States, and in a similar way you should then look at your country. And let's see if I find there some interesting countries where we can do this. Okay, so, well, then let's remember the Ricardo model, which was about comparative advantage. And now we want to start to relax one of a very, very strong assumption which we made in the Ricardo model, because in the Ricardo model, in the end, we had only one production factor. And this was labor. And also we assumed that labor is totally flexible. Well, but if we look in reality, then of course we see that, well, from a philosophical standpoint, we can say in the end, it is always the production factor trade. You have to dig into the earth to get the metals out of it and so on. But if we look in an economic way on the production process, then of course also in general we divide the production factors or the production situation into different factors, and especially that we are dividing in the common production factors, capital and labor. And yeah, what we also see is that in the Ricardo model, more or less, we saw that opening your borders for international trade will implement always a win-win situation for both trading partners. The only reason is that you have different comparative advantages, and there you can say the situation that no country has a comparative advantage, that this would be only by chance, because it is only you only need to have a difference of a slight difference of the slope of your production possibility frontiers of your transformation curve. But we find not only that we have different production factors, we also see that when you want to start to open your country for the world market, that in general, not everybody in your country will scream hooray, well, let's cut down the borders. And well, due to different production factors, of course, we said the very extreme outcome of the Ricardo model is that you fully specialize in the production of this product where you have your comparative advantage. And there you can say, in general, if you have not only one production factor, so that still everybody has its work, we can say then if you have this specialization due to the comparative advantage, that of course some production factors won't be needed then anymore. And there, not very surprisingly again, this means that if you open your borders, that in the end you will have a redistribution of the incomes in your country due to the change of your production situation. If you are shifting to the production of some other goods where you have your comparative advantage, then maybe some production factors of the other goods where you have reduced your production, that they will not be needed anymore, and the owners of these production factors, for them you have then a reduction in income. So trade, of course, influences the income distribution, and this of course means the reason is that the change of production between these sectors is not cost-free. This cost-free assumption we have made in the Ricardo model, and of course about this I have also already talked. We have different production factors and therefore we have a change in the demand for the production factors. And so now we introduce other production factors in general, and we make still with these new production situations still a very strong assumption that now we say we have some still flexible production factors. If we increase the amount of the production of one good, then some of the production factors, some of the workers of the other sector can move to the new sector where we have the increase, but in general we find, so to speak, and therefore this model is called the specific factors model, that we have some very specific production factors which we can use only in one sector. Well, and I think you also has entered my macroeconomics course, and there I made these historical perspective introducing the circular flow, that if we go back 300 years in time, then the main production sector was the agricultural sector, and there we can say more or less we have two production factors. One is of course still labor, and the other one is of course land area. Well, of course, for industrial production we also need land, but of course we definitely do not need that much land as we need it in the agricultural sector. So we can say then in the agricultural sector, this huge amount of land is of course a specific production factor which we more or less need only in this sector. For example, specific in the agricultural sector. Well, and if we go to the industry, then of course we find in some production situations very specific machines which we more or less can use only in the pharmaceutical sector or in the automobile sector, where we cannot just change or just exchange these machinery into other sectors. For example, in the pharmaceutical, chemical, or automobile sector. And especially if we have a look at the automobile sector, there we really see the change of these specific factors in production. Now, especially when we look at the change to electromobility. Especially nowadays due to the change to mobility. And this, of course, is also depending on a non-flexibility of high-skilled labor. And this, of course, here in the old automobile sector has already a large impact on the labor market in Germany. Because many of the very high-skilled workers working in our classical automobile sector, these guys we won't need anymore because we do not need their skills in the future. And there you see especially older people around the ends of 50s, beginning of 60s, they could still work 5 or 10 years. They get now an offer of about 500,000 euros, a million euros. Please stop working. Start your retirement right now. So I think it is not very hard to argue that in many situations we have these specific production factors. Yeah, and now comes after these assumptions the theoretical part, similar to the Ricardo model. Still, we have two countries, A and B, and we have two goods. Let's interpret this classically that we have an agricultural sector with producing grain. Agricultural sector and machinery. This we can interpret as an industry. Sector. And now we assume that we have two production factors, labor and capital. And here, since we have said, well, high-skilled labor can also be specific, so this we can in general is interpreted as low skilled labor, that this is almost always flexible, but capital should be just specific. Here we made this assumption. Cannot be moved, and labor is flexible between the sectors. And of course, then we have, due to our market situation, just a division of our all total labor supply. This should be constant. Total labor supply. And this is now somehow due to the production function divided into the two sectors, and the sum, since it's totally flexible, then have to equal the total amount of labor, while capital, think of a tractor, think of land or a specific machinery in the industry sector. This is just, so to speak, fixed in one sector. You can use it or you cannot use it. And then overall, two production factors, two goods, two countries. We have a, so to speak, 2x2x2 model in then 6 dimensions. And I don't know if I have written down in this in the Ricardo model. Compare Ricardo model. There you had, so to speak, 2x2x1, because we had two countries or two goods, two countries, but only one production factor. So, and then next week we will talk about how we model production, and since it's classical trade theory, then very surprising we take the neoclassical production function with this characteristic shape. And for this, maybe you can just have a look in your macro, micro, business administration introductory courses. And no, not next week, Thursday. We will then meet again and go on then to the theoretical part of this model. Yeah, especially you can already look up what has it meant that we have positive but decrease in marginal product, and what has meant constant returns to scale production. So, thank you very much for today and see you on Thursday.